I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old. Just take a second to let the absolute weight of that sink in. It's mysterious, it's super dramatic, and it immediately makes you wonder, what exactly are these ancient dark sayings? Well, today we're going to decode a really dense 72-verse ancient poem that was actually designed as a historical parable.
So let's dive right into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly incredible piece of ancient literature, Psalm 78. At its absolute core, this text is tackling a huge concept, using the power of memory to break a generational cycle of rebellion. And honestly, it's a deeply human issue that is totally relevant to us right now. It's all about how remembering our history, both the good stuff and the terrifying stuff, is literally the only way to move forward without repeating the same devastating mistakes in our own era.
To help us navigate this epic poem, here's our roadmap. We'll be looking at 1. Teaching the coming generation, 2. Rebellion in the wilderness, 3. Recalling the plagues, 4. A compassionate yet wrathful God, and finally, 5. The Shepherd King.
All right, kicking things off with part 1, Teaching the Coming Generation. We're starting exactly where the author starts, by laying out the explicit thesis and the ultimate purpose for even recording this history. If you look at the header right at the very top of the text, it says, a maskil of Asaph. Now that word maskil is absolutely crucial. Basically, it implies instruction. It's a teaching poem specifically designed to make the reader wise. Asaph is telling us right out of the gate that his goal is to pass down the glorious deeds of the Lord to children who aren't even born yet. He wants to make absolutely sure that these dark sayings from of old and the things that we have heard and known are not hidden from the next generation. So the whole point here is preventative. Asaph writes this so that the next generation should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation. And he gives this highly specific, really tragic example in verse 9, the Ephraimites. He points out that even though they were armed with the bow, they had the weapons, they had the tactical training, they still turned back on the day of battle. Why? Because a well-armed generation with amnesia is, well, they're defenseless. They didn't keep the covenant because they simply forgot what they were supposed to remember.
Which brings us to section 2, Rebellion in the Wilderness.
That sheer failure of memory leads us straight into the historical examples of the stubbornness. Just look at this crazy contrast here. It brilliantly illustrates the maddening cycle they were stuck in. On one hand, you have God's miraculous provision in the middle of a barren desert. He split solid rocks so water gushed out like rivers. He commanded the skies to open, raining down manna, literally described as the bread of the angels. And he provided meat like dust. But then on the other hand, the people's response is just pure rebellion. Despite literally seeing rivers flow from solid rock, they cynically tested God, demanding the specific food they craved, and even had the audacity to ask, can God spread a table in the wilderness? Verses 21 through 27 capture this incredible, almost paradoxical tension. When the Lord heard their complaining, he was furious. A fire was kindled against Jacob because they just didn't trust his saving power. Yet, and this is the wild part, almost in the exact same breath, he opens the doors of heaven and rains down sheer, unimaginable abundance. It's a staggering picture of a deity responding to deep insult with both fiery anger and overwhelming, miraculous sustenance. Meat like dust, winged birds like sand, it's just epic in scale.
Moving right along to section 3, Recalling the Plagues.
So how did the people get so incredibly cynical in the first place? Well, the poem suddenly flashes back in time to Egypt to remind the reader exactly what unbelievable events these folks had somehow managed to forget. Just think about the sheer scale of the marvels that took place in the fields of Zoan. Rivers turning into literal blood so they couldn't even drink, swarms of flies and frogs that devoured and destroyed everything, entire crops wiped out by locusts, vines shattered by hail, sycamores ruined by frost, cattle struck by thunderbolts, and finally, the striking down of every firstborn in Egypt. The author lists these massive, nation-toppling events to show how completely absurd the Israelites' forgetfulness was. And honestly, it kind of makes you wonder, what massive mercies in our own lives do we completely forget the second things get a little uncomfortable? Let's jump into section 4, A Compassionate Yet Wrathful God. This brings us to the profound theological heart of Psalm 78. We see a deity caught directly between strict justice and deep, deep mercy. I actually want to slow down here for a second because the poetry in this section is just incredibly poignant. How exactly does Psalm 78 define compassion? It says that God repeatedly atoned for their iniquity and restrained his anger. He chose not to stir up all his wrath, and the reason given is breathtakingly gentle. He remembered that they were but flesh. He looks at this rebellious, incredibly stubborn generation, and he just sees them as fragile, describing them beautifully as a wind that passes and comes not again. But of course, humanity's response to that compassion is deeply flawed. When we look at verses 32 through 45, we see this repeating cycle of superficial repentance. The text tells us that when God brought severe consequences, when he literally killed them, then they sought him. They repented and sought God earnestly, suddenly remembering he was their rock. But it was entirely fake. The text literally says they flattered him with their mouths, they lied to him with their tongues. Their hearts were not steadfast at all. They just wanted relief from the punishment. They didn't actually want the relationship. And eventually, this cycle hits a devastating, absolute breaking point. In verses 46 through 64, we see the ultimate rejection. The people just pushed the boundaries way too far, provoking God with high places and moving him to jealousy with their idols. So God did the unthinkable. He utterly rejected Israel. He completely forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the very tent where he lived among mankind. He delivered his power to captivity and handed his own people over to the sword. Fire devoured their young men, and widows made no lamentation. It is a total systemic collapse of the nation, all because of their absolute refusal to remember.
Finally, we reach section 5, the Shepherd King. But thankfully, the story doesn't end in ashes. God decides to intervene personally to permanently break this destructive cycle of forgetting. Notice this massive transfer of divine favor. The author tells us that God awoke as from sleep, and he made a definitive choice. He explicitly rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the northern tribe of Ephraim, remember them from the beginning of the poem, the ones who turned back on the day of battle? Yeah, instead of them, he chose the tribe of Judah. He chose Mount Zion, a place he loves, to build a sanctuary founded forever. And to lead this newly centered nation, he made a really specific, honestly surprising choice. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob his people. The poetic symmetry here is just, it's fantastic. God completely bypasses the established powers and goes straight out to the pastures. He takes a literal shepherd, someone whose day job was gently guiding and protecting nursing ewes, and elevates him to guide an entire wandering, forgetful nation.
And this brings us right to the poem's conclusion. God's ultimate solution to a rebellious flock wasn't just throwing more miracles at them or unleashing more wrath. It was providing a faithful human leader. The text ends by saying that David shepherded them with an upright heart and guided them with a skillful hand. To break the cycle of a generation whose heart was not steadfast, God provided a guide whose heart was upright.
So Psalm 78 leaves us with this stark, unavoidable reminder. The history we forget is the history we are doomed to repeat. It shows us that passing down our stories, our biggest failures, our mercies, our turning points, is absolutely vital for the survival of the next generation. So I want to leave you with this to chew on. If your generation's history were written as a parable, a moschil meant for instruction, what warnings would you pass to the next? Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and keep learning.